At the end of the first chapter of the short story, there are several pages that are entitled Understanding and Evaluating Fiction. There is a reminder that the stories have study questions that follow them, but that they certainly are not exhaustive. And I also want to remind you that the end of each chapter has suggestions for writing. All of these things are intended to help you as you read through the stories and decide what you want to focus on for your writing assignment. When you read the first time, you read for enjoyment, and then you read again to evaluate. So since you're going to spend time with the story, you certainly want to choose something that you found appealing on some level, whether it's the characters, the plot, the ending, what you felt were symbols within the story. But initially read for enjoyment. That's what you're in the process of doing now. And then you read again for evaluative purposes. What we're going to do is look at the points that the text suggests you consider to evaluate stories. The first is plot and structure. There are some terms that we need to make sure we understand the meaning of, but primarily I want you to think in terms of how the story is put together. The text refers to the protagonist as a central character. The antagonist is any force that is opposed to the protagonist. There may be more than one protagonist in a story. We need to consider the conflicts, which is any clash of ideas or actions, desires or wills. Those conflicts may be physical, intellectual, moral, or emotional. If a story is well written, it is considered to be unified or to have unity. And in that case, nothing is irrelevant. Every character, the setting, the dialogue, the behaviors, the events, all contribute to the meaning of the story. And if there is artistic unity, everything is relevant to the total meaning or to the total effect of the story. When we look at unity, we also want to look at whether or not there's a logical relationship between events, as opposed to plot manipulation. In fiction, we refer to the term deus ex machina, which is Latin for God from the machine, because sometimes the character is rescued by something unexpected, a God from the sky. So we want to know if the story is unified, if there is a logical relationship, and if it all makes sense, and we don't have to have something come from the outside to make it all work. We look at the ending of the story. When we say it's happy, we mean that there is a satisfying resolution. If it is unhappy, it may be justified, but it may also require us to consider the complexities of life. It may be indeterminate. As in life, there are sometimes not definitive conclusions or resolutions to conflicts. So we may have something that is unresolved that we carry forward out of the story. If there is a surprise ending, is it fairly achieved, as with the story of An Hour? And is it justified? Within that idea of unity and ending and plot, we look at the place of chance and coincidence in the story. Chance is when there is no apparent cause in the preceding events or in the disposition or predisposition of the character that would cause an event to take place. And coincidence is when there is chance and there is a specific connection. So does chance come into play? Does coincidence come into play? And if so, is it the beginning of something? And initiates? Does it complicate? Does it cause conflict? Does it resolve something? And is it probable? There is chance in life. We're not going to take it out of the story at all. However, how does it enter into the overall structure of the story? When we talk about suspense, we wonder what's going to happen next. But is it a mere page turning and then what happens? Or is there some element of the structure that helps to develop suspense and makes us wonder what will happen next? Is there a mystery, a set of circumstances that have to be explained, or is there a dilemma, a position in which a character must choose from two undesirable courses of action? And again, with surprise, is it fairly achieved? Does it serve a significant purpose within the story? Is that a legitimate purpose? Is it justified? Or does the surprise simply divert attention? And finally, is the story a formula story? Is everything as expected? Did we sort of know what was going to happen before it began? Did the hero win the girl? Did the knight in shining armor come and rescue the maiden? Those would be formula stories, and the expected is what happens. So when we look at plot and structure, who are the characters? What are the conflicts? Is everything relevant to the whole? Can anything be taken out and the story still be the same? What kind of ending do we have? Do chance and coincidence come into play in the story or the ending? And if there is surprise, is it fairly achieved and does it contribute to the story as a whole? The next thing we consider when we look at a story, besides plot and structure, is the characters. How are the characters revealed? Whether they are protagonist, antagonist, major, or minor. Are we simply told about them? Is there a direct revelation of character? That is, we're told who the characters are. We're told about them. They're described. Or is the character revealed indirectly? That is, are we shown? Do we see how they behave, how they interact, what they say? Indirect is one way that the character is revealed. Is the revelation sufficient? And are there contrasts established? So when we're learning about the character, how do we learn about the character? Is it only what we're told, or is it what the characters do and say and how they interact with the setting, with the other characters in the story? When we look at characterization, we consider whether or not the character is consistent. That means that we can understand why they do what they do and that action makes sense. So if we have a character that seems to be honest and good, then we would expect their behavior to reflect that. Is there some reason that they would not behave that way? So is the character consistent with the way the character has been revealed to us? And when they behave, can their behavior be understood? Can we understand why? And does it make sense? We also want to look at how the character is developed. We talk about round characters and flat characters. And a round character is one that has dimension, that is complex, sort of a three-dimensional character, one that we know a lot about and that we understand a lot about through the description, their actions, their dialogue, their interactions. A flat character has little dimension, and basically we can describe them in a sentence or two. They're typically minor characters who play some purpose, but they're not central to the story. And then a stock character is a special kind of flat character, the stereotype, the nosy neighbor, or the unfaithful friend. We see them and understand them very quickly. They serve a purpose, but is the story populated with stock characters and flat characters, or do we have multidimensional, complex characters that we come to understand? Does the character develop? That is, does the character undergo a change? Either a change in their character, from good to bad, or from conscientious to problematic. Is there a change in their personality? Do they go from timid to bold? The way they look at the world? Do they have an epiphany, that aha moment when they come to some realization? If the character develops, is the change believable? And is it believable not only the change itself, but is it consistent with the character? Back to, can we understand why? Does it make sense that the character would change in this way? Is there sufficient motivation for this character to change? And is there sufficient time? That is, over the course of the story, would the character have made that kind of change given the circumstance? And then the last kind of character is a static character. That is, as opposed to developing. That character remains the same. They don't change. They remain as they are with regard to their character, their personality, and their outlook. One type is not bad and the other good. They all serve particular kinds of purposes, but as we look at characterization, consider, how is the character revealed? Can we understand the character's motivations? How developed is the character? And are there changes, or does the character remain the same? After considering our plot structure and our characters, we also want to look at point of view. From what point of view is the story told? We may have an omniscient narrator, one who knows all, who comments, who interprets. The omniscient narrator can be any place, any time, inside a character's head, outside. We have certain advantages and disadvantages from the omniscient point of view. Is the point of view third person limited? That is, we have one perspective that's telling the story, but that perspective, that narrator, has access to perhaps thoughts and observations, makes comments or interprets. So we know more than one person would know, but there is some limitation to what that narrator provides to us. We also may have a first-person narrator. One of the characters, major or minor, tells the story from that point of view as an observer. I tell the story of what's happening. Stream of consciousness is when we're inside the character's head and we get to know what that character thinks and feels and says, but they are almost, they're a first-person narrator, but we really are, it is an internal dialogue that's taking place. And then there is the objective or dramatic point of view, in which the narrator observes but does not comment or interpret. And we can think of that sort of as a camera watching and observing, letting us see through the lens what is there but not offering commentary. We want to identify the point of view and we want to consider whether or not it's consistent. Is it the same all the way through? And if it's not the same, are the shifts justified? Do they make sense and are they plausible? What advantages are there to this point of view based on the purpose of the story? I referenced early on in the course about To Kill a Mockingbird and the fact that we have a first-person narrator who is a child. The advantage of that is we have the story told through the voice and through the eyes of a young innocent. And so what has become pervasive in the society, in the culture, does not make sense to that character. So the advantage of having that character tell the story is particularly important. When we have a first-person narrator, we need to consider what the limitations are of that character. Is the character reliable? Is the character interpreting the events appropriately? As with Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, we know what her limitations are, and we understand the limitations she has in interpreting the events, but that contributes to the purpose of the story itself. Does the point of view serve to reveal or to conceal? And is information withheld from any characters? That is, do we know things that the characters don't know and don't understand? And is that consistent with the point of view? And is it consistent with the overall unity of the story? Symbols, as you know, have literal meaning. That is, they are what they are, but they suggest a meaning that represents something more universal. If there is symbolic meaning, that meaning must be supported by the context of the story as a whole. It has to be consistent with the story and what's communicated there. We need to consider if there are symbols, and if there are they central to the story? That is, do we have to know that they are symbolic in order to understand the story, or do they simply reinforce the meaning? Having a symbol that reinforces the meaning sometimes is even more powerful, because you have a great story, but then it has a new depth of meaning. Is the setting symbolic? Does the setting carry meaning beyond what is provided by the location? An allegory is a story with a second meaning, that is, that there is actually sort of a parallel meaning to it. We want to know if that meaning is clear or ambiguous. And fantasy is when we have non-realistic elements, things that transcend the boundaries of known reality. When we have fantasy, we need to look at the assumptions that the fantasy is based on. And then within those assumptions, the fantastical assumptions, the story still must have a kind of logic to it. Is the fantasy there for its own sake, or does it serve to help express a truth as far as the story is concerned? We can also look at humor and irony, which serves to temper and control our emotional responses. When there is humor, does it contribute to the meaning of the story, back to our plot and structure and artistic unity, or is it simply there to amuse us or to serve as a comic relief so that we get to leave behind some drama for a moment? When we look at irony, we look at situational irony, which is a contrast between appearance and reality, or a contrast between expectation and what is actually there. Dramatic irony is a contrast between what the character says or thinks and what we know to be true. And verbal irony is when a character says one thing while meaning another. Again, these things should contribute to the purpose and overall meaning of the story. And finally, with regard to general elements, look at the title. How does it contribute? When we looked at poems, there were titles that gave us insight into the meaning of the poem. Is there one element that is particularly important? Is the plot particularly important? The character, the setting, the symbol, the theme? As we look at stories, we are looking at a story in a chapter that focuses on an element. So think in terms of how that element is particularly important in that story. We look at setting. Is it essential to the story, or could the story have taken place anywhere? And does everything work together to support the purpose or what seems to be the meaning of the story? Do all the parts contribute, or is there some part that is irrelevant or doesn't seem to fit in or seems inappropriate? Now, even though your text addressed it earlier, I saved theme for last, because sometimes we find a theme in a story, but sometimes we look at one of those other elements. The theme, though, connects the greatest number of elements in the story and relates them to one another. We can call it a central insight or controlling idea. It is a revelation about human character, about the nature of human beings, or about the relationship between human beings and each other or the world around them. We may not agree with what we understand the theme to be, that insight or controlling idea. But if we see a theme within a story, it may allow us to see what the world looks like to others, or allow us to understand something that we might not have understood before or otherwise. So is there a theme? And if there is it implied or is it stated? If we have a theme, it should be a view of life. It should be the central and unifying concept of the story. It should not be contradicted by anything within the story. You should not reduce it to a cliche. Don't judge a book by its cover. And it is not a moral. It's not a lesson necessarily that we take away from it. But it can be stated as a generalization of life, but it may not be it may not be a universal generalization, but it may be something that we take away about the character of individuals in a particular circumstance. And as a result, it may be specific to the kind of construct that you see within the story. So as you read, think in terms of first reading for enjoyment. And when you find a story that you enjoy of those that are assigned or another story from the course text, that is probably the one that you should choose to write your paper about. Once you've done that, read it again, thinking in terms of these elements that we have addressed: plot and structure, characterization, symbol, humor, irony, theme. What can you identify? You don't have to address all of them. You can address one of them. Again, remember that there are study questions after the stories that may help you focus, and there are suggestions for writing at the chapter ends that may help you focus an idea that you have. Read for enjoyment. Choose something you enjoy to analyze for a paper.